What if I told you that one of Silicon Valley's most celebrated companies, valued at $9 billion, was built on a lie so massive it endangered the lives of thousands of people? What if the charismatic Stanford dropout CEO everyone compared to Steve Jobs was actually running a fraud that fooled presidents, generals, and billionaire investors? In the next 20 minutes, you're about to discover the shocking true story of Theranos, how Elizabeth Holmes convinced the world she'd revolutionize blood testing with technology that didn't work, how she silenced anyone who questioned her, and how the biggest medical fraud in history finally collapsed. This is Bad Blood. Let's begin. Bad Blood by John Carreyrou is the definitive account of the Theranos scandal, one of the most spectacular corporate frauds in American history. Carreyrou, an investigative reporter for the Wall Street Journal, broke the story that exposed Elizabeth Holmes and her company's deception, winning a Pulitzer Prize for his journalism. This book reads like a thriller, but every word is true. Theranos promised to revolutionize healthcare with a device that could run hundreds of medical tests using just a few drops of blood from a finger prick. No more vials of blood drawn from veins, no more expensive lab tests, just a tiny sample and revolutionary technology that would democratize healthcare. It was an inspiring vision that attracted hundreds of millions in investment, partnerships with major retailers, and coverage in every major media outlet celebrating Elizabeth Holmes as the next Steve Jobs. There was only one problem. The technology didn't work. It never worked. And Elizabeth Holmes knew it didn't work, yet she continued raising money, signing deals, and putting patients' lives at risk with inaccurate test results. This is the story of how she built the fraud, how she maintained it through intimidation and deception, and how it all came crashing down when brave whistleblowers and determined journalists refused to be silenced. Understanding this story isn't just about one fraud. It's about the dangerous mythology of Silicon Valley, where charisma and vision can override due diligence and scientific reality. It's about how corporate culture can become toxic and abusive. It's about the importance of regulatory oversight in healthcare. And it's about the courage required to speak truth to power when doing so can destroy your career. The promise. Elizabeth Holmes founded Theranos in 2003 at age 19, dropping out of Stanford to pursue her vision. She was brilliant, ambitious, and already displaying the characteristics that would define her rise and fall. Absolute conviction in her mission, unwillingness to accept criticism, and remarkable ability to convince others to believe in her vision despite lack of evidence. The founding story she told was emotionally compelling. Her uncle died of cancer, and she believed that if diseases were caught earlier through more accessible blood testing, lives could be saved. She envisioned a world where anyone could walk into a pharmacy, get a finger prick, and receive comprehensive health information cheaply and quickly. No more avoiding doctor visits due to cost or fear of needles. Healthcare would be democratized. This vision was powerful because it addressed real problems. Traditional blood testing is expensive, inconvenient, and scary for people who hate needles. Lab results take days. Many people avoid necessary testing due to these barriers. If Theranos' technology worked as promised, it would genuinely transform healthcare. The problem was making the technology actually work. Holmes recruited Sonny Balwani, a much older businessman who became her boyfriend and later president of Theranos. Balwani had made money in the dot-com boom and projected confidence, despite having no medical or scientific background. Together, they created a culture of extreme secrecy and control. Employees worked in silos, unable to share information even internally. Questions were met with hostility. Dissent was crushed. The early team included talented engineers and scientists who genuinely believed in the mission. They worked incredibly hard trying to make the technology function, but there were fundamental scientific problems. Running hundreds of tests from tiny blood samples was exponentially more difficult than traditional testing. The Edison device, Theranos' main product, produced wildly inconsistent and inaccurate results. Engineers raised these concerns to management repeatedly. They were ignored, retaliated against, or fired. Holmes began fundraising by leveraging her Stanford connections and natural charisma. She cultivated a distinctive personal brand, black turtlenecks mimicking Steve Jobs, an unnaturally deep voice she adopted to seem more authoritative, and an intense, unblinking stare that unnerved people. She spoke in inspirational platitudes about changing the world, but avoided technical details about how the technology actually worked. When pressed on specifics, she claimed proprietary secrecy. Investors were dazzled. Here was a young female founder in the male-dominated tech world with a compelling personal story, tackling a massive market opportunity. Holmes was articulate, passionate, and projected absolute confidence. Due diligence was shockingly minimal. Investors took her claims at face value, assuming the technology must work, or she wouldn't be so confident. This was the Silicon Valley model. Bet on the founder, the vision, the potential, not boring details like whether the product functions. By the mid-2000s, Theranos had raised tens of millions and was valued at hundreds of millions despite having no working product, no revenue, and no validation from the scientific community. The discrepancy between valuation and reality was already staggering. But this was just the beginning. The deception deepens as Theranos grew. So did the gap between Holmes's public claims and internal reality. She began signing partnerships and commercial deals based on capabilities the technology didn't have. The company needed revenue to justify its valuation, so Holmes promised customers functionality that didn't exist, assuming her engineers would eventually make it work. This is where ethical lines were clearly crossed. She wasn't being optimistic about future potential. She was lying about current capabilities. The Edison device remained fundamentally flawed. It couldn't reliably run most of the tests Holmes claimed. So, Theranos began a secret practice of diluting the tiny finger prick samples to create enough volume for testing, which further compromised accuracy. Even more shocking, they began secretly running most tests on traditional blood testing machines purchased from other companies, completely defeating their supposed revolutionary approach. Employees who discovered these practices faced immediate retaliation. Engineers and scientists who raised concerns about accuracy were fired. Legal threats became routine. Holmes and Balwani created an atmosphere of paranoia where people feared speaking up. They hired expensive lawyers to send threatening letters to employees who left, claiming they were violating non-disclosure agreements, even when they weren't. Former employees were terrified into silence. The culture inside Theranos became toxic and abusive. Balwani, particularly, was described as aggressive and demeaning, screaming at employees and creating a climate of fear. He had no scientific training, but overruled engineers on technical matters. Turnover was extremely high, but the secrecy prevented departing employees from warning others or the public about what was really happening inside. Despite the internal chaos and non-functional technology, Holmes excelled at external storytelling. She recruited an impressive board of directors loaded with famous names: Henry Kissinger, George Shultz, James Mattis, and other luminaries from politics and military. Notably, the board had almost no one with medical device or diagnostics expertise. These were big names who added credibility, but couldn't evaluate whether the technology worked. It was all for show. Holmes became a media darling. Profiles in Fortune, Forbes, and other major publications celebrated her as the youngest self-made female billionaire, the next Steve Jobs, a revolutionary entrepreneur. She spoke at conferences alongside heads of state. She appeared on magazine covers. The media coverage was universally positive, amplifying her narrative without critical examination of whether the science was sound. Journalists were dazzled by her charisma and vision, just like investors. The turning point came when Theranos partnered with Walgreens to put testing centers in stores. This deal brought Theranos into direct contact with real patients, which meant real medical consequences from inaccurate results. Inside Theranos, employees were terrified. They knew the technology didn't work reliably. They knew patients would receive incorrect results that could lead to wrong diagnoses and treatments. But Holmes pushed forward, assuring partners and regulators that everything was validated and accurate. It wasn't. Patients began receiving wildly inaccurate test results. Cancer indicators showing up when there was no cancer. Diabetes results that were completely wrong. Pregnancy tests showing false positives. These weren't minor errors. These were results that could lead to unnecessary treatments, missed diagnoses, and genuine harm. And Theranos knew about these problems, but continued operating, prioritizing business partnerships over patient safety. The whistleblowers. The heroes of this story are the employees who risked everything to expose the truth. Several stand out for their courage in facing a powerful company with unlimited legal resources determined to destroy anyone who challenged them. Tyler Schultz, grandson of board member George Shultz, joined Theranos full of idealism. He believed in the mission and was honored to work for a company his grandfather supported. But as he worked in the lab, he discovered the massive discrepancies between what was promised and what was real. He saw the inaccurate results, the manipulation of data, and the use of traditional machines instead of Theranos technology. He documented problems and reported them to management. He was rebuffed and threatened. Tyler faced an excruciating choice. His grandfather was one of his heroes, a former Secretary of State, whose judgment he respected. But George Shultz completely believed in Elizabeth Holmes and refused to believe his grandson's concerns. Holmes manipulated the elder Shultz, portraying Tyler as a disgruntled employee spreading lies. The family rift was devastating, but Tyler refused to stay silent even when it cost him his relationship with his grandfather. Erica Chung was another young employee who witnessed the problems firsthand and decided to speak out. She saw proficiency testing failures, where Theranos' results were so far off that any legitimate lab would have shut down operations. She saw manipulation of quality control data. She reported these issues internally and was marginalized and eventually forced out. Like Tyler, she faced massive legal pressure after leaving, but she refused to be intimidated. These whistleblowers initially tried going through proper channels, reporting to management, documenting problems, hoping leadership would address issues. When that failed, they went to regulators, but they discovered that regulatory agencies moved slowly and had limited resources to investigate well-connected companies with powerful lawyers. Theranos stonewalled regulators, using the same secrecy and legal aggression that worked on employees. The whistleblowers then made the crucial decision to speak with journalists, specifically John Carreyrou at the Wall Street Journal. This was enormously risky. Theranos had a fearsome legal team led by David Boies, one of America's most famous and expensive lawyers. They routinely sent threatening letters and filed lawsuits to silence critics. Speaking to a journalist meant potentially being sued into bankruptcy and being blacklisted from the industry. But the whistleblowers understood that the only way to stop Theranos was public exposure. Regulators weren't acting quickly enough, and people were being harmed by inaccurate results every day. They provided Carreyrou with documentation, connected him with other former employees, and helped him build an airtight case despite Theranos' obstruction. Carreyrou's investigation was methodical and careful. He knew Theranos would attack any story viciously, so every fact needed multiple sources and documentation. He interviewed dozens of former employees, reviewed internal documents, and consulted medical experts. He navigated threats from Theranos' lawyers and direct intimidation attempts from Holmes herself, who tried to get his editors to kill the story. The Wall Street Journal backed Carreyrou, despite enormous pressure. Theranos mobilized powerful allies to lobby the newspaper's ownership to stop publication. Holmes personally called Rupert Murdoch, the journal's owner and a Theranos investor, asking him to stop the story. To his credit, Murdoch didn't interfere with the journalism. The editorial team stood behind their reporter. The unraveling. When Carreyrou's first article published in October 2015, exposing that Theranos was using traditional machines for most tests and that its technology was unreliable, the response was explosive. Holmes immediately went on a media counteroffensive, denying everything and attacking the journal's credibility. She appeared on television looking directly into cameras with her characteristic intensity, calling the story false and insisting the technology was revolutionary. But the dam had broken. Regulators who had been slow-acting suddenly moved aggressively. Federal agencies inspected Theranos facilities and found appalling conditions: unqualified personnel running tests, improper procedures, inaccurate quality controls. The full extent of the deception became clear to authorities. Within months, Theranos was barred from operating labs and faced potential criminal charges. More former employees came forward once the initial story published, providing additional evidence of fraud. The narrative Holmes had carefully constructed collapsed as the truth emerged. Partners like Walgreens terminated relationships. Investors who had poured in hundreds of millions realized they'd been deceived. The board members with prestigious names quietly distanced themselves. Holmes continued denying wrongdoing, even as her company disintegrated. She pivoted the narrative, claiming she was a victim of sexism, that male entrepreneurs were given more benefit of the doubt. This attempted defense ignored the fundamental issue. The technology didn't work, and she had lied about it to investors, partners, and patients. The fraud wasn't alleged, it was documented. The personal toll on whistleblowers was severe. Tyler Schultz spent hundreds of thousands on legal fees defending himself against Theranos' attacks. His relationship with his grandfather remained shattered for years, though they eventually reconciled before George Schultz's death. Other whistleblowers faced similar legal and personal costs. They sacrificed their savings, their reputations, and their careers to do the right thing. Their courage cannot be overstated. Theranos officially shut down in 2018. The company that was once valued at $9 billion was worthless. Investors lost everything. Hundreds of employees lost their jobs. And thousands of patients had received inaccurate medical results with unknowable consequences for their health. Holmes was indicted on multiple counts of wire fraud and conspiracy. After years of legal maneuvering, her trial began in 2021. Prosecutors presented overwhelming evidence of deliberate deception, internal emails and messages showing she knew about problems yet lied to investors, forged documents, and manipulated results. The defense argued she believed in the technology and was overly optimistic, but not fraudulent, a claim contradicted by extensive documentation. In January 2022, Holmes was convicted on 4 counts of fraud against investors. She was acquitted on charges related to defrauding patients, not because she didn't deceive patients, but due to technical legal issues with how those charges were structured. In November 2022, she was sentenced to 11 years in federal prison. Balwani was separately tried, convicted, and sentenced to 13 years. The lessons. Bad Blood reveals critical lessons about entrepreneurship, corporate governance, and accountability that extend far beyond one company's fraud. First, charisma and vision are not substitutes for results. Silicon Valley celebrates founders who reality distort, who inspire people to believe in seemingly impossible visions. Steve Jobs legitimately did this, which is why many compared Holmes to him. But there's a fundamental difference between pushing people to achieve difficult goals and lying about whether those goals have been achieved. Jobs demanded excellence, but Apple's products worked. Holmes demanded loyalty, and Theranos' products didn't work. Yet she lied and said they did. Second, secrecy in the name of competitive advantage can hide fraud. Theranos used trade secrets as justification for extreme opacity. They wouldn't share technical details with anyone, not investors, not partners, not regulators. This prevented scrutiny. In reality, transparency and peer review are essential in science and medicine. The refusal to publish findings, submit to independent validation, or allow real due diligence should have been massive red flags. Instead, people assumed secrecy meant valuable intellectual property. Third, boards of directors should have relevant expertise. Theranos' board was packed with famous political and military figures, but almost no one with medical device or diagnostics expertise. These impressive names added credibility, but couldn't evaluate the technology or ask hard questions. A proper board would have included scientists and medical experts who could assess whether claims were plausible. This was board composition as marketing, not governance. Fourth, journalists and investors must maintain skepticism. The media coverage of Holmes and Theranos was embarrassingly uncritical for years, stories read like press releases celebrating her brilliance without examining whether the technology worked. Similarly, investors performed shockingly little due diligence, relying on reputation and charisma rather than validation. The mythology of the young genius founder disrupting stodgy industries overrode basic scrutiny. Fifth, regulatory agencies need adequate resources and speed. The FDA and CMS had the authority to shut down Theranos much earlier, but moved slowly due to limited resources and bureaucratic processes. Meanwhile, patients received inaccurate results. There's tension between not stifling innovation and ensuring medical devices are safe and effective. This case shows the cost of regulatory failure, real harm to real people. Sixth, whistleblower protections are essential, but insufficient. The people who exposed Theranos suffered enormously for doing the right thing. They faced legal threats, career damage, and personal costs. Current protections didn't prevent companies from using expensive lawyers to intimidate and exhaust resources of individuals trying to report fraud. Stronger protections and support systems are needed for people who risk everything to expose wrongdoing. Seventh, corporate culture matters immensely. The toxic environment Holmes and Balwani created, paranoid, secretive, abusive, intolerant of dissent, wasn't just unpleasant. It enabled fraud. When employees are terrified to raise concerns, when questioning is treated as disloyalty, when turnover is so high that institutional knowledge disappears, bad behavior flourishes. Leadership sets culture, and Holmes deliberately created a culture where truth couldn't survive. Eighth, medical fraud has unique moral weight. If Theranos had been a social media company overstating its technology, it would be unethical but less grave. But this was healthcare. Inaccurate blood test results directly affect medical decisions. False cancer indicators lead to unnecessary biopsies and treatments. Missed diabetes diagnoses lead to untreated disease. The decision to continue operating while knowing results were unreliable demonstrates sociopathic disregard for human welfare. The broader implications. The Theranos scandal illuminates broader problems in Silicon Valley's approach to disruption, particularly in regulated industries like healthcare. There's a dangerous belief that tech entrepreneurs can enter any field, ignore domain expertise and regulation, and revolutionize it through sheer will and engineering brilliance. Sometimes this works. Uber and Airbnb genuinely disrupted industries. But healthcare is different. Human biology is complex. Medical devices must be proven safe and effective. Shortcuts can kill people. Holmes embodied the worst aspects of Silicon Valley mythology. Fake it till you make it is a common startup philosophy. Project confidence even before achieving results to attract capital and talent to eventually make the vision real. But there's a line between optimism about future potential and lying about current capabilities. Holmes crossed that line repeatedly. She didn't fake it till she made it. She faked it while knowing she couldn't make it, and kept faking it while people were harmed. The case also reveals how gender dynamics complicated responses. Holmes benefited from being a rare female founder, attracting investors and media eager to celebrate women in tech. But she also claims she was held to different standards and attacked more harshly than male founders would be. There's probably truth in both. She exploited her demographic novelty and faced extra scrutiny because of it. But ultimately, fraud is fraud regardless of the founder's gender. Using sexism claims to deflect from documented deception is cynical manipulation. The investor class emerges looking foolish. Sophisticated investors with access to expertise and resources were conned by someone who had never previously built anything. They didn't ask hard questions, didn't demand proof, didn't insist on independent validation. They invested based on narrative and charisma. This reveals problems with venture capital culture where social proof and founder pedigree override diligence. If famous investors are in, others pile on without doing their own homework. The personal stakes make this more than an abstract fraud story. Real people received wrong test results. A woman was told she had miscarried when she hadn't. Patients believed they had serious conditions and underwent treatments they didn't need. Others missed actual problems because tests showed false negatives. The human cost is unknowable, but definitely not zero. People's health and well-being were sacrificed for Holmes's ambition and ego. Bad Blood tells the story of the biggest biotech fraud in history, but it's ultimately about something larger, the danger of unchecked ambition, the importance of truth in science and medicine, and the courage required to speak truth to power even when it costs everything. Elizabeth Holmes had genuine intelligence and talent. If she had pursued her vision honestly, accepting the scientific challenges and working within reality's constraints, she might have built something valuable, even if less revolutionary than promised. Instead, she chose deception. When the technology didn't work, rather than pivoting or shutting down, she lied and put patients at risk. That choice reveals character, and that character was fundamentally corrupt. The whistleblowers are the real heroes: Tyler Schultz, Erica Chung, and others who sacrificed so much to expose the truth. They faced powerful opponents with infinite resources compared to their own. They endured legal threats, career damage, and personal costs. Yet they persisted because they understood the stakes. People were being harmed, and someone had to stop it. Their integrity and courage saved lives. John Carreyrou's journalism was essential. In an era of declining investigative reporting, his meticulous investigation and refusal to be intimidated showed journalism's crucial role in accountability. The story broke because a reporter did the hard work of finding sources, verifying facts, and standing firm against legal threats and pressure from powerful interests. This is what journalism should be. The Theranos story is a warning. It warns entrepreneurs against substituting vision for truth. It warns investors against due diligence shortcuts. It warns media against uncritical celebration of charismatic founders. It warns regulators against being too slow or deferential. And it warns society against believing that youth, charisma, and bold vision exempt anyone from basic ethical requirements, like not lying about whether your medical device works. As you think about this story, remember it's not ancient history. It happened recently in one of the most sophisticated business environments on Earth. If it happened at Theranos, it can happen elsewhere. The only defense is skepticism, due diligence, transparency, and willingness to speak up when something seems wrong, even if doing so is costly. The mythology that surrounded Elizabeth Holmes, young genius, Stanford dropout, the next Steve Jobs, revolutionary disrupting healthcare, was powerfully seductive. People desperately wanted it to be true. A young woman shattering Silicon Valley's glass ceiling while democratizing healthcare is a compelling narrative. But reality doesn't care about our narratives. The technology worked, or it didn't. The claims were true, or they weren't. The final lesson is perhaps the most important. Character matters more than charisma. Elizabeth Holmes was brilliantly charismatic. She convinced some of the smartest, most accomplished people in the world to believe in her, despite mounting evidence they were being deceived. But charm without integrity is dangerous. Vision without honesty is fraud. Ambition without ethics is sociopathy. Choose integrity over image. Choose truth over narrative. Choose doing what's right over doing what's expedient. These sound like platitudes, but the Theranos story shows they're anything but. They're the difference between building something real and building something that collapses, destroying wealth and potentially destroying lives in the process. Bad Blood is required reading for entrepreneurs, investors, journalists, and anyone who wants to understand how smart people get fooled, how frauds happen despite safeguards, and how truth eventually emerges when brave people refuse to stay silent. Read the book, learn the lessons, and remember that the next Theranos is probably being built right now somewhere, and only skepticism and accountability can stop it before it causes harm.